What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Doyne Farmer. Dr. Farmer is a complex systems scientist and entrepreneur who pioneered many of the theories and applications that we discussed today, including chaos theory, complexity science, artificial life, and wearable computing. We live in an age of increasing complexity. You've heard it 1,000 times. It's an age of accelerating technological change and global connectivity, and it holds more promise and peril than arguably any time in human history. Successfully navigating these changes will depend immeasurably on the quality of our economic models, because at their heart, all these changes, the changes associated with trends in automation, digitization, demographics, and financial markets, are rooted in the economy and the networks of systems and organizations that keep us alive. For the first time, using big data and ever more powerful computers, we are now able to apply complexity science to economic activity, building realistic models of the global economy and financial markets that promise to vastly outperform in terms of verisimilitude and predictive power anything that we have seen in human history. Today's conversation is broken into two parts. The first hour is meant to provide you with a foundational understanding of complexity science and its application to the world of economics. We discuss chaos and volatility and compare the explanatory and predictive power of agent-based simulations to the standard economic model. The second hour is an exploration of economic frameworks that treat the economy as an ecological network and series of metabolic processes. We also apply the lessons of the first hour to specific economic and financial questions related to investment styles, risk management, technological disruption, and policy making. If you want access to that part of the conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this truly exceptional and profoundly educational conversation with my guest, Dr. Doyne Farmer. Doyne Farmer, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
It's exciting to have you on, Dr. Farmer. I want to, for people that are watching this from our YouTube video, I have a copy of your book here, Making Sense of Chaos, which I read in the past week ahead of this conversation, which I'm very excited about. And you and I have spoken before, and you know that I also was fortunate enough to get to stay at SFI, where you're recording this from, the Santa Fe Complexity Institute, in early 2018 for about a week. And I had interviewed a number of people, including Jeffrey West from the Los Alamos National Laboratory, where you are at or were at, as well as Brian Arthur, who is also someone who is one of the founders of the field of complexity economics, which is really the sort of the larger topic that we're talking about today. But we're going to begin with a conversation about complexity science itself, some of the philosophical questions to give people a foundation. And before we go there, what I would love to do is learn a little bit about your background and you and your story, because you're a really interesting guy. Your work in this field goes back to, well, unofficially, I guess, the 70s. So tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got initially interested in studying science and mathematics.
Well, I was strongly influenced. I grew up in a little town called Silver City, New Mexico, and there was a physics professor named Tom Ingerson who arrived in town when I was about 12 years old and was a huge influence on my life, both in terms of science and in terms of nonconformist philosophy about life and everything else.
What was it about this particular person that got you interested in these subjects?
Well, I always kind of knew I wanted to be a scientist. When I was at my Boy Scout meeting, actually, he showed up and said he was a physicist. And I went, wow, I don't know what that is, but I have a feeling that's what Einstein was. And I knew I wanted to be something like that. So I attached myself to him, and he ended up playing a very strong mentorship role for me.
So what was your path after that? You went to university to study what, physics?
I studied physics at Stanford and then UC Santa Cruz. And when I was at UC Santa Cruz, I fell in with a group of other fellow travelers who were interested in chaos and complex systems, even before we had names for those things. And then when the opportunity came along to actually do research on chaos, I immediately took it along with my friends. Because there was nobody who knew anything about that in the physics department at UC Santa Cruz, we self-advised each other. So we formed a little group we called the Dynamical Systems Collective, and more or less served as bootstrapped our way up as fellow thesis advisors.
So chaos is a feature of complex systems. Maybe the best place to start is complexity science itself. What is complexity science, and what makes a system complex?
So something's complex if it exhibits emergent properties that are qualitatively different from the properties of the building blocks that make it up. So, for example, if you take a neuron's it's a cell that's a little stimulus response box. You put a signal in, signals come out. But if you hook up 80 billion neurons in the right way, we get something like this conversation. You get something that's completely different than what it started with. The other example that I stress in the book is the economy, where we all do highly specialized tasks, but the economy as a whole allows us to do things that we could never do on our own and to be much better off than we would be if we all acted by ourselves.
So what are the origins of complexity science as a discipline or as a set of ideas?
Well, it really goes back to Adam Smith, who put out the idea that specialization really amplifies our ability to feed ourselves. And, Darwin, I would say, was already thinking in complex systems terms, because evolution, it's a remarkable idea that descent with variation and selection can give rise to complex organisms like human beings. It got rolling as a more official line of inquiry after World War II with the work of Norbert Wiener and the cybernetics movement that died out for various political reasons and was replaced by what we now call complex systems.
Was Adam Smith's invisible hand the first conceptualization of the concept of emergence in social science?
Well, I would say anywhere, not just in social science, although actually it turns out there's an Arab philosopher named Al-Ghazali who had these ideas already in 1100. I wasn't aware of that actually when I wrote the book. One of the great things about writing a book is people go, hey, did you know about this? And he actually laid out the same basic idea already in 1100 AD.
So let's talk a little bit about chaos. I said it's a subset of complex systems. Some complex systems exhibit chaos. First of all, what do we mean by chaos? And let's separate, because one of the interesting things about science is that words end up taking on a very different meaning, whether it's things like information and information theory, in this case, chaos. What do we mean scientifically by the word chaos?
So scientifically, we mean a system that has sensitive dependence on initial conditions, meaning if you make a measurement, very nearby initial conditions diverge exponentially as you go forward in time so that they can become very far apart later in time, which means that practically speaking, the system becomes unpredictable because tiny differences in where you start make eventually a huge difference in where you end up. The other property of chaos that's fascinating is endogenous motion, meaning that even though there's nothing built in that says anything should be moving, things keep moving over the long term. A great example would be sitting by a mountain stream. The stream bed's fixed, the input of the water to the stream is fixed, and yet the water splashes and swirls and acts as if it had a will of its own. And that's just an example of chaos and endogenous motion.
So now we're getting into a mix of a number of philosophical questions I have, and I'm kind of torn between asking you about attractors or delving a little bit more into the predictability or lack thereof of chaotic systems and what makes such systems more or less predictable. So for example, let's talk about roulette, because in your book, you describe an anecdote from your past in the 1970s where you and your friend actually tried to beat the house in Vegas. You guys developed what I think is the first personal computer. You wore it. I think you had the batteries under your armpit, which is kind of wild because it required so much energy at the time. So you guys must have been sweaty, and probably because you were sweaty, you were probably easy targets for the local goons of the casino. So I also have a question about how you guys survived this. But you guys actually tried to beat the house by predicting or developing a model for assessing the likelihood of the ball falling on a certain number or on a certain color after it left the area where it's dispensed. I'd love to hear a little bit about that story as well, but just for this question, what makes a system like roulette, for example, or the weather so much harder to predict than planetary motion or the trajectory of an arrow shot from a bow?
Well, roulette has sensitive dependence on initial conditions. The croupier releases the ball spins around the track, the ball eventually leaves the track, and when it leaves the track, there are little diamonds they put around as it's heading towards a cup, or it can bounce off the lip of a cup. So tiny little differences in where the ball is going can make a huge difference in where the ball eventually lands up, which is why even though a roulette wheel is a deterministic dynamical system, obeys the laws of physics, it's used as a random number generator by casinos.
So it wasn't entirely clear to me, because I don't think you actually explained this in the book, but how were you guys, first of all, how much better were your odds at predicting where the ball would land than your average person who's sitting at a roulette table? And how were you doing that? Were you doing that by trying to sort of approximate where the ball was, on what number it fell when it exited the dispenser, and then figure out from there the velocity and then where it would end up?
So the way it worked is that we had switches on our shoes that talked to a computer. It wasn't the first personal computer, but it was the first wearable computer. And it was even certainly the first concealable digital computer. And so we had wires coming up from our toes, connecting to the computer. We would look at the ball going around the track, make a click when it passed a reference point on the track, make another click after it made a revolution. We would do the same for the rotating disk in the center around zero. And then the computer would do the calculation, solving the equations we programmed into it, and make a prediction about roughly where the ball was going to land on the wheel. We took advantage of the fact that you can bet more or less up until the last minute in roulette. So we would start clicking, the computer would make a prediction, and then we would put bets down on numbers in the region where we thought the ball was most likely to land. And we had about a 20% advantage over the house. So we did beat the house. We didn't just try to beat it, we beat it. And on average, we made about 20%, meaning for every dollar we put down, we made about $1.20 in return.
So did you guys have any run-ins with the local mafia in Vegas?
Well, we did have a couple of close calls where the house detectives got wind of us and we had to scoot out very quickly. We never got hauled into the back room. I have to say that, we were graduate students. We were kind of nervous about getting beat up in the back room, and we never really went to the high stakes we would have needed to go to in order to really beat the house. We also had a lot of hardware problems, so we probably spent 5 hours fixing computers for every hour we spent playing.
I was telling you this because you and I have spoken before, that when I read the book, one of the thoughts I kept having in my head was that these guys are way too smart to be doing this. They should be doing other things with their time. But it was obvious that you guys had a very adventurous mindset. You were tinkerers, you were playing. And there was probably also, I imagine, a desire to kind of go against authority, I imagine, as well, right?
Well, there was the Robin Hood mentality behind the whole effort.
So I don't think you mentioned Pierre Laplace in the book, but correct me if I'm wrong if you did. But Pierre developed a thought experiment whereby he imagined that if some creature, which he called Laplace's demon, knew the position and motion of everything in the universe at a single moment, then the laws of physics would give it complete knowledge about the future position of everything in the world or in the universe, in the known universe. Do complexity scientists generally believe that the world, in other words, reality, is deterministic, but that it is so complex, so overladen with information, to quote Joseph Ford, that humans can never hope to comprehend it in a way that can be solved mathematically?
Well, maybe just to say it a little bit differently, the reason Laplace's statement isn't true is because of chaos. Because you make the measurement, even if you know all the forces acting on something, as you go forward in time, the uncertainty in the measurement will cause uncertainty in your ability to predict and puts a limit on how far into the future you can make predictions. So that means that, you really can't predict the far future. There's always going to be uncertainty because somewhere there's always chaos in what's going on. Even in celestial mechanics, you can't predict more than about 20 million years into the future because of the nonlinear interactions of planetary motion.
So how does that uncertainty reflected in or align with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle?
Well, so that means there's an intrinsic limit on how accurately you can measure anything. So that places a fundamental limit on measurement, and chaos places a fundamental limit on prediction. And they act together to place a fundamental limit on how well anything can be predicted.
So let's go back a little bit here or zoom out to complex systems. Does a complex system need to be complicated? This is a word that we are, again, familiar with using, and people might assume that this is the case, but is this true? I mean, how many degrees of freedom or moving parts does a complex system require?
Complex systems can actually be very simple. You can get chaos in a simple map of the interval 0, 1 into itself. So if you take an equation as simple as, 4 times the position on the interval times 1 minus the position on the interval equals the next position on the interval, that simple mapping bounces around the interval in a random looking way and is chaotic. So it can be extremely simple. And so complex systems, while they can be complicated, I gave the example of the human brain earlier, they don't need to be complicated. I think I should also say that chaos is just one example of a complex system's behavior. It's a way of making chaos out of order. There are also many other interesting examples where you get order out of chaos, and those are the hardest ones to understand.
Well, that's actually one of my questions, which is how can disorganized configurations of matter spontaneously become organized?
Well, it's a question that we don't fully understand, and we probably won't understand for a long time. We have lots of examples. We understand aspects of how that works. There are theories now, for example, for how something like a virus can self-assemble to make copies of itself. But I can't give you a simple pat answer for how that happens. Because
we're converging now on the same territory that religious scholars have for thousands of years. And these are also questions that just come up in philosophy. I'm curious, do you have a sense of, you kind of answered me, but I guess I'm going to ask you again. Do you have a personal sense of what the answer might be that isn't maybe purely scientific? Does faith or religion converge on some answer here that you think is?
No, I think we don't need faith or religion. We do understand enough about this to know we don't need that. It's a very surprising thing, but true nonetheless, that if just following the laws of physics, we can reduce things to the rules that the individual components are following, and their interactions can cause rich, complex behavior. Be it simpler examples might be bird flocking. If you've ever watched starlings swirl around in the sky, or schools of fish, we can have, I gave examples of chaos or turbulence in the weather, but there are many simple examples where interactions can produce very orderly behavior. We don't need religion to do that. It just flows from the laws of physics and the underlying nonlinear dynamics of complex systems.
So we were talking a moment ago about the difference between simple chaos and complicated chaos. I think Lorenz's attractor qualifies as an example of simple chaos. That probably is a good opportunity to talk about attractors in general. First of all, what are attractors and what different types of attractors are there? And how does this fit into the study of complexity science?
So attractors are what things settle down to after a long period of time. So, for example, take the suspension system in your car. If you jump on the bumper, the car may bounce up and down a little bit, but then it will settle to rest. So that's an example of what we would call a fixed point attractor. Things just settle to rest. And that's a very common kind of attractor you encounter in everyday experience all the time. A more complicated attractor might be a metronome, where if you let the metronome go, it starts oscillating back and forth, and it oscillates back and forth in a regular way as long as the spring remains wound. Chaotic attractors are a more complicated kind of attractor where motion is contained in a specific region. It has certain specific characteristics, but it's nonetheless quite complicated and never settles down either. It has endogenous motion. So those are, roughly speaking, the three basic kinds of attractors.
So in the example of the oscillator, is the oscillator a limit cycle attractor, whereas the spring is a fixed point attractor?
That's right.
And is Earth's gravity a fixed point attractor for people that are living on the Earth?
Well, it is in the sense that if you fall down, you hit the Earth and, you come to rest. So in that sense, it's a fixed point attractor. I mean, if you're an astronaut and you get out of your capsule, you're in orbit. And so there is no fixed point attractor there. So gravity per se, it really depends on the setup.
All right. So again, we're kind of flying through a lot of terms here, which is great because I want to give people a foundational understanding of this field of thought and thinking before we get into the conversation about complexity economics, which is the application of these ideas to the study of economics and financial markets. I think you mentioned dynamical systems. What are dynamical systems?
Dynamical systems are the kind of things we've been talking about. They're rules that says if you know something about the world now, they allow you to project into the future where things will change. So with Newton's laws of gravity, give you a dynamical system that tells you how mass moves through time. I mentioned earlier the rule 4x1 minus x. That's a dynamical system because it says if you know what x is at some point in time, you can say what x will be at some future point in time. And you just follow the rule and you can just follow what it's going to do as you go forward into the future.
So would that be an example of a nonlinear dynamic system?
That's an example. Anytime you have a rule, like the one I said, 4 times x is, say, the position on 0 to 1, times 1 minus x, that's a simple rule that's not linear because you're multiplying x with itself. And it gives you a rule that tells you if that's x at time t, it gives you x at time t plus 1. And then you can take x at t plus 1 and get x at t plus 2. And you can just get a sequence of numbers going forward into the future. And it's a dynamical system because it's a rule that tells you, starting with a state, which in this case is just the position between 0 and 1, it tells you the next state, and then the state after that, and so forth.
So let's talk about linearity and nonlinearity. What makes a system nonlinear?
So a system is nonlinear if it's not linear, and it's linear if it's equal to the sum of its pieces. That is, if I instead took the rule 4 times x, that system's linear because you're just taking a number, multiplying by x, and the number is fixed, and that just blows up in that case. But generally, if you can express something as the sum of its components, then it's linear. It's nonlinear if you can't do that. So the example I gave, 4x times 1 minus x, there's that x squared term, because if you factored it out, you'd have 4 times x minus 4 times x squared. And x squared is a nonlinear term because you have multiplication. As soon as you start multiplying things by themselves, then you have nonlinearities.
Is nonlinearity a prerequisite for emergence?
It is a prerequisite. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary.
What else is required?
Well, that's the je ne sais quoi. There's no simple rule for what else is required. Generally, actually, you have to do computations to figure out whether you're going to have emergence. You can't know a priori whether it's going to happen. You have to do the hard work of actually simulating the system to understand whether you're going to see emergent properties.
So one of the things that you talk about in the book, as we kind of get close to moving to the conversation about complexity economics, are heuristics as a way of thinking about complex systems theory as it applies to how we think about the world. So what are heuristics, first of all?
So heuristics are rules of thumb, simple rules that are useful, like imitate the best. If you're in a group of people and you look around, you see somebody's doing a good job, you go, hey, I'll try and do what they're doing and get better. Trial and error, you try different things out, you pick the thing that works best. Those are examples of simple heuristics. And we use heuristics all the time to make decisions and about the things that we're doing and trying to do well.
So where does inductive reasoning fit into all of this? Is this an example of inductive reasoning? And are complex systems more amenable to being understood through induction rather than through deduction?
Well, yes, generally I would say induction works better. I mean, we use both depending on what's most well suited. But induction is basically looking at the world, trying to see the patterns that it follows, and therefore inducing, and then applying those to understand going forward. It's in contrast to deduction, which involves writing down axioms and then deducing something from those axioms using mathematics. And we do some of both, but complex system scientists, and maybe what differs between complexity economists and mainstream economists, is we do make more use of induction.
So let's talk about complexity economics. First of all, it seems like, in my reading of it, complexity economics is not necessarily a discipline. It's more that it's like the application of complexity science or the ideas of complexity science to the problems of economics. Why has this failed to overtake standard economic theory as the dominant paradigm in economics, if it's so much better in your view?
Well, it's inherent in the way it works, and that the ideas of complexity economics were first articulated by Herbert Simon in the early 1960s. And back in those days, computers were about 1/1000th as powerful as they are now. So to really do this, we need good computers. We need good data. Computers have allowed us to collect data that we just didn't have back in the 1960s. And we've also accumulated a lot more knowledge about human psychology. So those three factors together mean that the time for complexity economics is now ripe. And we are beginning to see demonstrations that it can do things that mainstream economics can't do.
So basically, the internet, the growth in storage capacity and processing capacity are the primary reasons why it is now the moment, in your view, for the rise of complexity science as a way of understanding economics and financial markets, the economy and financial markets.
That's right.
So let's talk a little bit about standard economic theory. What are the core assumptions of standard economic theory? And also, how do we define and sort of wrap our arms around what it is we're talking about when we say standard economics?
Yeah. So let me first of all distinguish what's called econometrics, which is making statistical models of the economy, from economic theory. In econometrics, you take data, you fit a function, typically a linear function, to the data, and then you use that to make inferences like what factors matter, what factors are influencing the phenomenon that you're trying to understand. In an economic theory, in contrast, you want to try and understand cause-effect relationships in a more fundamental way. And economic theory works by assigning all the agents in the problem you're interested in a utility function. It's a score function that says what the preferences of those agents are. And then you write down equations that describe the decisions that allow you to deduce the decisions those agents will make that maximizes their utility, typically taking the utility of other agents in the economy into account. And all economic theories proceed in that way. In contrast, in complexity economics, what we do is write down rules for how people make decisions. They might be simple heuristics. They might be learning algorithms that allow them to keep updating the way they make decisions as they go along. Information flows into the system. The agents make their decisions. Those decisions have economic consequences that create new information. New information may also flow in from outside. The agents make a new set of decisions, and then you just go around that loop again and again. So it's a very different way of doing things than in mainstream economics.
So without getting into comparisons yet between agent-based models or simulations, which is what complexity researchers like you rely on, and standard economic theories, and we'll get into those differences, is an accurate theory, putting aside again the differences, is an accurate theory of how a system works always superior to a statistical regression? So we're talking about econometrics here. Is it always superior to a statistical regression that seeks to formulate predictions by drawing lines through incomplete data sets? And is the reason because the data set is open?
No. I mean, there are many cases where you can actually do better by a statistical model, econometrics as it's called in economics, than you can by building a fundamental theory. It really depends on the purpose. For example, if you want to predict sunspots are still predicted based on taking the history of sunspots, fitting a function to that history, and then projecting forward. Why? Because even though we understand what causes sunspots, we can't measure what's going on inside the sun. And so it's just feasible to do what I just said. So for some predictive purposes, it can be better to make econometric models or statistical models. But if you want to understand why something happens, it's better to have a theory. And if you need to make counterfactual predictions, that is, predictions about the world as it might be, you really need a model a more fundamental theoretical model. Because in the statistical model, the relationships you find, you only know they're going to be true as long as the world continues to operate as it has been operating in the data you're looking at. But if you make a fundamental change by, for example, introducing a new policy, you can change the way the world is working, and then your historical data is no longer a good guide to what's going to happen in the future. So to understand cause-effect relationships, you're always on more solid ground if you have a fundamental model that's built on cause-effect relationships to begin with.
So when I asked you about some of the core assumptions of standard economics, I do think you mentioned utility maximization, though you may not have articulated it that way. I don't remember you saying anything about rational expectations, and certainly not about equilibrium, but if you did, I apologize. Let's start with equilibrium. What is meant in economics by the term equilibrium? And does equilibrium exist in agent-based simulations?
Yeah, so equilibrium in economics can be, broadly speaking, one of two things. One is simply that supply equals demand. The other is, in game theory, equilibrium corresponds to a situation where the players of the game have strategies that are the best strategies they can have unless the other player makes a wild change in what they're doing. And so when an economist says equilibrium, they can really mean that in either one of those two senses. Now, in an agent-based model, we don't assume equilibrium, in contrast to mainstream economics, which does assume equilibrium. In an agent-based model, equilibrium can emerge as a result of the action of the system on itself, or it may not emerge. It really depends on the circumstance. And that's one of the strengths of complexity economics, because there are situations in the world where equilibrium is just a bad assumption, and complexity economics models can do a better job at dealing with those situations.
So let's talk about rational expectations. Again, I don't think you mentioned it. What is rational expectations theory in economics? And what is the difference between bounded and unbounded rationality?
Yeah. So rational expectations means that you're making optimal use of all the information that you have, and that the agents can make any calculation they need to make use of that information. It's a little bit like Mr. Spock in Star Trek. The agents that do this are sometimes called, within economics, homo economicus. Now, bounded rationality, an idea that was put forth by Herb Simon, who I mentioned already, is the idea that, well, we can only make certain calculations. But, if we're playing chess, we might be able to look 2 or 3 steps ahead. Maybe brilliant chess players can sometimes look 6 or 8 steps ahead, but there's a limit to how much we can compute. And that can make an important difference in understanding what's going on and in the way the economy behaves. So bounded rationality just refers to the fact that we aren't perfectly rational. We only have a limited amount that we can go forward. And while economists will all agree that we aren't perfectly rational, there's a question of whether is that a good enough approximation to get us where we need to go. It's a debated point in economics itself. And there's a whole field of economics now called behavioral economics that focuses on the ways that we aren't rational. I would argue that, and that's well documented and uncontroversial at this point. The question is, how do we incorporate that into economic theory? And we complexity economists feel like complexity economics is a really good way to incorporate bounded rationality into economic theory and to incorporate behavioral economics into economic models.
Is utility or the development of utility functions in economics an area where behavioral science has had a positive impact in an attempt to sort of capture what we're talking about right now?
So behavioral economics has shown that real utility functions can be different than what economists normally assume, and in fact, may not satisfy all the formal mathematical properties that are usually assigned to utility functions. So it said that, but it's also about our models of the world, which is, let's say, in addition to utility functions, you can build models where you assume everybody has a utility function that they try to maximize, but that their model of the world is not perfectly rational, so that the utility they get is not the same as the utility they would get if they were perfectly rational. Though utility and rationality are two ideas that work well together, and hence most of the workhorse models that places like the Treasury Department or the Federal Reserve use to make economic judgments with are still built around rationality and utility maximization.
So again, we're kind of going rapid fire here. This is uncharacteristic, but it's actually great because I think this is going to really help people as we get into a conversation about applying some of these ideas to the economy and markets. So let's talk about efficiency. What do we mean when we talk about efficiency in the economy and markets?
Well, so there's two different ideas of efficiency that are important to distinguish. One is called informational efficiency, and that basically says it's hard to beat the market. I mean, the idea behind informational efficiency is that in its strong form, it's not possible to come up with a strategy that does better than the average player. There's another notion of efficiency called allocational efficiency that says that prices are set optimally, meaning that, because prices, after all, direct activity. If prices of pigs go up, then people are going to grow more pigs. And so you want prices to be set so that we allocate effort so that it produces what's best for all of us. And so allocational efficiency says that that is happening. Deviations from allocational efficiency mean that resources are being allocated in a poor way. And one of the points I make in the book is that I think, and I present evidence for the idea that markets are maybe pretty close to informationally efficient, but they're pretty far away from being allocationally efficient. Even though in simple theories in economics that make strong assumptions, those two ideas are the same, one implies the other. In the real world, where those assumptions are violated, the two can be very far apart.
So is informational efficiency synonymous with the efficient markets hypothesis?
Well, the efficient markets hypothesis is really both. I would say that the markets are both informationally and allocationally efficient. The focus is generally more on the informational efficiency part and the fact that that it's hard to beat the market. 30 years ago, when I first started working in economics, people took informational efficiency pretty literally. The cracks have been hammered into that foundation. People will now, most reasonable economists will acknowledge that there are counterexamples. Our trading system that we built at Prediction Company is one of them. There are many other examples where people made profits that exceeded those that the average player would make where people beat the market. But it's hard to do. And so to first approximation, it's fair to say the market's hard to beat. But the allocational part, I think there's a lot of evidence that I talk about in the way prices respond to new information. For example, most large price moves in the market are actually not in response to any new information. They're moves that just happen. They're the market acting on itself endogenously, to loop back to our earlier conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests that the market has chaotic motions that just occur and that the market makes its own information in some way. The market is already making news.
What would be a good example of that? Like, is the 1987 crash an example of endogenous motion at work in financial markets?
Yeah, I mean, there was no particularly interesting outside news on the day of the 1987 crash where the market dropped by almost 20% in one day. Instead, most people believe that it was fueled by new financial instruments that greatly amplified what otherwise would have been a small correction in the market. So it is the market acting on itself because the market's not perfect and causing a wild price swing where there was no good reason for such a swing to happen.
So let's go back a little bit to the difference between agent-based models and neoclassical or other standard economic models of how the world works. One of the things that I don't think we touched on is diversity and the ability for agent-based models to better capture the diversity of actors in the world versus standard economic models. How do they do that?
Well, agent-based models are computer simulations. So you write down the rules the market follows, you write down the decision-making rules that agents are going to follow, and then you just simulate everything using a computer algorithm that you write the code for. And so that gives you a huge amount of flexibility. You can easily have millions of agents that are living inside the computer and that you're tracking through time. And those agents can all be different. So you very easily can deal with heterogeneity in the economy, which can be important if you're trying to understand something like macroeconomics, where it really matters that old people have different consumption habits than young people. Wealthy people have different consumption habits. And you can really track all of that in an agent-based simulation. It's much harder to do when you have to write down equations. It's a hot topic in economics, and economists are trying to do it, but it's just a much bigger challenge for them. And consequently, they can't do it with as much realism as we can in complexity economics.
So one of the things you talk about in the book is the importance of making plausible assumptions. I think you say we should be focused on modeling the world as is as opposed to as if. What is it that makes an assumption plausible, whether we're dealing with standard models or agent-based simulations?
That you're actually following the mechanisms that really get followed in the real world. Maybe to give an example, we have a model of housing markets. Now, a mainstream economist will assume equilibrium by assuming that supply equals demand. So in other words, that at the point where prices are set, that the number of sellers equals the number of buyers. But that's not how things work in real housing markets. In real housing markets, the sellers go to a real estate agent, typically. They find some comparables, houses that have been sold recently that are similar to theirs. They may make a few adjustments. They put the house on the market and they see whether it sells. If it doesn't sell, they mark it down. If it still doesn't sell, they mark it down again, and they keep doing that until either they sell the house or they take it off the market. That's actually something that's called aspiration level adaptation. It's a heuristic that's used to buy and sell houses. It's not easy to write down in equation form, which is why mainstream economists don't like to use it, but it's how things really work. And it makes a difference in the model, because when you're using the realistic model of aspiration level adaptation, then you see that you can have situations where you have 20 times as many buyers as sellers or 20 times as many sellers as buyers. The market can be very far from equilibrium, and that makes housing prices more sluggish than they would otherwise be, and it really makes things behave differently. So that's an example of what I call verisimilitude, meaning doing things in a way that matches the way they work in the real world.
So I have a couple more questions before I'm going to move us to the second hour, Dr. Farmer. One of those questions has to do with, again, endogenous motion. And an example of that in financial markets is volatility. What explains the phenomenon of volatility in financial markets if we're looking exclusively at endogenous factors or endogenous shocks?
Yeah, I mean, one of the features of markets is what's called the excess volatility puzzle. Prices in markets move a lot more than you would think they should based on the movements of the fundamentals. And what we see in agent-based models, where we set up markets and we set up agents that are participating in markets, following diverse, boundedly rational strategies, is we automatically get excess volatility. It happens as soon as, for example, you have trend followers, people who believe that if the price is going up, it's likely to keep going up. And so they see the market go up, they buy, they see the market going down, they sell. That kind of behavior is inherently unstable. And so it creates excess volatility. Another example are market participants who use leverage. That is, they borrow money to buy assets they wouldn't otherwise have the money to buy. And that also amplifies volatility because their borrower, if the market glitches down, that means their leverage goes up, and the borrowers will ask them to pay back part of their loan. And in order to do that, they typically sell the asset that they've taken out the loan to buy. And so it means that when prices glitch down, those leveraged players sell into a falling market, which amplifies that downward movement. It makes the market more unstable. And both of those mechanisms make excess volatility. That's, I would argue, one of the main contributions of complexity economics is in giving us some insight into how that works and what causes excess volatility.
So, Dr. Farmer, I'm going to save the rest of my questions for the second hour, actually. We'll tie off a few more questions I have about leverage and volatility, as well as how we model risk, the difference between risk and uncertainty, because there's another interesting conversation in the book around the use of value at risk models. And you actually make the case that the widespread use of VAR coupled with the leverage ratios that we saw heading into the 2008 financial crisis were sufficient to have caused the crisis on their own without any exogenous shocks. And there's this fascinating part of the book where you deal with the economy as an ecological network and as a metabolic process. So I want to get into that, including trophic levels, and how you use these to graph both the actual economy itself as well as financial markets. And when it comes to financial markets, identify where risk exists. In fact, actually, you did this for the real economy during the COVID pandemic, and you were able to predict with a very high degree of accuracy, at least relative to the standard predictions being made by the, the health officials in Great Britain, where you were actually providing this information to. So I want to get into that. I also want to get into places that we could possibly apply these models in government, in geopolitics, and also talk a bit about the phenomenon of passive investment and the risks that it poses in the context of what we're talking about just now, which is, again, the makeup of investment styles within a market and how that can lead to endogenous shocks. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Dr. Farmer, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Dr. Farmer, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.